We don't understand our weapon because we don't understand that prophylactic vaccines should not be used in the midst of an epidemic. And we don't understand exactly what the virus is doing. So we go to a war and we don't know our enemy, we don't understand the strategy of our enemy, and we don't know how our weapon works. I mean, how is that going to go? Then people say, well, I mean, yeah, politicians will probably say, we have been advised by the scientists, and scientists, will maybe point to somebody else. But this is now a situation. I'm asking every single scientist to scrutinize, to look what I'm writing, to do the science, and to study exactly I call this the immune pathogenesis of the disease. And because, I mean, I like people to do their homework. And if the science is wrong, if I'm proven wrong, I will admit it. But I can tell you, I'm not putting my career, my reputation at stake. I would not do this when I would not be 200%, convinced. And it's not about me, not about me at all. It's about humanity. People don't understand what is currently going on, and we have an obligation to explain this. And I posted my paper on LinkedIn, and I invite all independent scientists, please, to look at it, because this can be easily understood by microbiologists, immunologists, geneticists.
Hello and good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining us for this tremendous conversation that we have to have with Geert Vanden Bossche. And for anyone who doesn't quite know, in March of 2021, I first had the opportunity to interview Geert, and it really was a one-off discussion, and it just exploded. Over 1.5 million views on YouTube, all over LinkedIn. I mean, it just happened. And Geert has become such an important stabilizing voice in the pandemic that I have had tremendous honor to be involved in this process. And I thank Geert for his openness and his honesty. And as well, I have today Shankara Chetty. I had the Geert interview in March of 2021. I had Shankara just a few months after. And Shankara's work with regards to protecting lives in South Africa has always stood out as one of the most valuable lessons that I can think of in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. I've had them before once, but I thought when I could bring this back again, having them together again to discuss Geert's book and the concepts that he's having, I couldn't resist the opportunity. So I add in Geert and Shankara. Wonderful. Thank you both for joining us. I think that it's great to have you all. What I'm going to probably ask is, starting with Geert, probably if you could just do an introduction and then Shankara afterwards.
Yeah, well, thanks first of all, Philip, for re-inviting me to this interview. I'm going to keep it brief. My original background is veterinary medicine, but early on in my career, I specialized at the university in virology, molecular biology, immunology, also environmental virology. And after about 10, 12 years in academia, I then moved on to industry. the vaccine industry, where I work with a number of big companies like GSK, Novartis, Solvay, etc. I worked in late development, so very close to the product, to the clinical studies, but also in R&D, in early development, where I was basically in charge of the development of adjuvants and characterization of adjuvants, also biophysical characterization of adjuvants, etc. And so after a career of also 12, 13 years in industry, I then moved on to work with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in Seattle, where I was a senior program officer, was in charge of the vaccine discovery entity. And I also worked with Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization in Geneva, closely working together with WHO and CDC and UNICEF, etc., especially on the Ebola crisis of 6-7 years ago in West Africa. And I did this more or less in parallel with my own consultancy company, work in my own consultancy company, and also work on natural killer cells that I see as a potential future target for vaccines. And of course, when the COVID crisis came around, I was very much alerted, being very familiar with vaccines, with immunology, with global health, etc. And I got immediately alerted when I heard that the purpose was all of a sudden to vaccinate massively people all over the world, and that this was declared not just a pandemic, but a health emergency of international concern. And that is where I started to raise my voice, as you started the introduction, Philip. Right. Over.
Excellent, thank you. And Shankara?
Thanks for having me again, Philip. I'm Shankara Chetty. I'm a general practitioner. I'm a natural science biologist. I did a Bachelor of Science degree in genetics and advanced biology at the University of Witwatersrand. And then I went ahead and did microbiology and biochemistry as sub-majors. I went to India after that and studied a Bachelor of Medicine and Surgery degree and started a general practice here in Port Edward, South Africa, which I've been running now for the past 20 years. When COVID arrived on the stage, I took the opportunity to understand what was going on and wanted to see patients and understand the clinical part of this illness. And so I've been a frontline doctor now for the past 3 years and come up with treatment protocols and basically negated the need for a vaccine in the pandemic. So yeah, interesting discussion ahead.
Wonderful, wonderful. So thank you. Now, Geert, I want to start off with the fact, because we're going to be focused really primarily around this book and what you're saying in it and how it's relevant to society generally. But it seems as though you had some censorship of this book on Amazon. What's going on?
Well, to be honest, Philip, I don't know exactly. And, I'm cautious, talking about censorship and all these things because, it's just so unbelievable that this book would be censored. My goal has been really to bring the science together and to really explain my scientific viewpoints. So it's still unbelievable to me that this book would be censored. But as a matter of fact, it seems that it's no longer available at Amazon.com, at least in the US. It was available at the very beginning, but then all of a sudden our account got frozen. The account got frozen, and seems like although people can still order the book in some parts of Europe, even somebody wrote me today that they have ordered the book in Japan. So it's really puzzling why it's no longer available. Is it censorship? Is it because the book is printed and edited as well in Europe as in the US? Is there confusion with the accounts? Nobody knows. But as a matter of fact, it's very clear that Amazon, despite repeated demands from our side and questions, they have not come up with a clear-cut answer. So it remains very, very mysterious what's going on. So I cannot rule out it's censorship based on the title, maybe. Really, I don't know, and it's very embarrassing, of course.
Yes, I can imagine that, Gert. And so Shankara and I got a chance to look at some of it. Now, it is a complex bit of information, and you had said this is not really it's not easy for the general public to understand. When you were writing it, who were you writing it primarily for, Gert?
Well, I was primarily the goal for me. The goal was to document the complexity of the pandemic. Because if laymen read this book, which it's very, very difficult. Of course, some sections they will understand, but other sections they won't. But what is important for me is that even if laymen are trying to read this book, they will immediately realize that these things are complex, that a pandemic is complex, and that as a result of the massive immune intervention that have taken place, things have become even more complex, and that is also very dynamic. So it's not like, the talk we hear all the time, guys, it's about antibodies, about the neutralizing antibodies. And, when you get your injections, the antibodies go up and you're safe, etc. No, it is much, much more complex. And if that is the only message that layman gets out of this, that this whole thing is way more complex than people are trying to make us believe, then it is certainly already a very important achievement. Because primarily I have been writing this book, for health authorities, for peers, for health experts, scientists to read it. And there is a lot of immunology in there, because in my humble opinion, the factors and the element that has been most ignored in the analysis and the assessment of the pandemic is the immunology that has been evolving. We hear people talking about neutralizing antibodies, but there's not only neutralizing antibodies, there's also the non-neutralizing antibodies. There's antibodies of high affinity, of low affinity. There are the infection inhibiting antibodies. And this whole immune response is also evolving as the virus evolves. And so it is, in fact, based, what I'm trying to reflect are the underlying immune mechanisms and immune dynamics that are driving this pandemic and the evolution of the virus. And I wanted this to document. I wanted also to illustrate the scientific rationale behind this, how I put the pieces of the puzzle together, so that nobody could ever say, oh, wow, this was completely unpredictable. Nobody could know this. We have done for the best. And, seems like the vaccine worked to some extent. So we continue boosting people, etc. No, there is a way to understand this. And I think from the very beginning, that's also what I'm documenting. It was very clear to me that there was, in fact, nothing more predictable than that this mass intervention, without knowing where this is going, would not have a happy end. And I've done my very best to document this to people, who have deeper insights in the several different elements and disciplines that are involved in the evolution of the pandemic. So that was my goal.
Excellent. And Shankara, what were your thoughts as I gave you just a few days ago, so I wouldn't expect you to have, detailed views on it, but just initial thoughts from what you were looking at.
I think the book is spot on. I think the audience, Philip, needs to understand that we're not talking about an individual immune response. We're talking about a population-based immune response. So we're looking at the entire population and their level of immunity, and how this virus will influence that immune response, and how the virus will respond to that immune response. And now we went ahead, without understanding the immunology around the disease itself, we went ahead and impacted on the immune response of the entire population. And that's going to throw a whole curveball into the dynamics of how this pandemic evolves. So I think Gert's work is vitally important. And it's vitally important for people to realize that the vaccine might have given us a very short-term individual benefit in preventing severe illness. But on a population scale, it's created the scenario where an explosion can take place. And that is where the problem lies. So we're dealing with a population-based immunity when we talk about Gert's work.
And so I have to ask on behalf of those people who would have been making the decisions. They would have been saying, listen, we have a pandemic, people are frightened, the world is locked down, we're developing a vaccine that can quite probably work to get to herd immunity. Let's go ahead. Why are you criticizing us now for doing that? Any thoughts for that? Any what's the word for it now? Do you feel any sympathy for those people who are making those tough decisions at the time?
Well, if the question is addressed to me, Philip, I will answer you right away. And in fact, I'm coming back to Shankara's analysis of the book, that it is not about the individual, that it is about the impact of mass vaccination. We are not talking about vaccinating 5% of the population. We are not talking, about vaccinating just one layer of the population. We are talking about mass vaccination. And of course, people have been worried about the vulnerable people in our population, especially we know them, people with underlying diseases, elderly, etc., and to protect them, like we do with the annual flu vaccine that we give to elderly people and people with frail immunity. But then the problem, or the thing where I have no sympathy, I must say, was to extrapolate this, for God's sake, I would say, to all of the population, right? First of all, it was very clear that there was no need to do that. And secondarily, we know that these vaccines, because, no matter what the technology is about, these are still, so to say, prophylactic approaches, prophylactic vaccines, in a sense that, of course, if you administer them before you get exposed to the disease or to the infection, you can, avoid getting infected. But this is no longer true when you vaccinate people during the pandemic, because these vaccines cannot induce sterilizing immunity. And then, of course, this is a textbook example of how you will drive immune escape. You will allow the virus to escape to that suboptimal immune response that many people will have before they get, or at the time they get exposed to the virus. And so that is something that should have known. That is just, for me, still unbelievable. I cannot understand this. I really cannot. And I know that other vaccine experts could not understand this either. But unfortunately, no, not everybody seemed to be in a position that they could speak up independently, right?
Yes, and so Shankara, I guess from that point of view, I always ask the question, and I always try and see if there is a way. What you don't want to do is condemn the person who has made a decision, even if it could be the wrong decision, because it makes them afraid of making tough decisions again. Is there anything from a clinical point of view that you would say, Shankara?
I think, Philip, the people that made the decisions in the pandemic have to be held responsible for those decisions. That's the reason they get the top money and hold the top jobs, and they're there to protect society. So at the end of the day, even if mistakes were made, I think those people that made the mistakes need to go back and be willing to ask the people that gave them advice as to where that advice came from. So, yeah, we got politicians making scientific choices. Unfortunately, that's the way the pandemic was run. So they took advice from different quarters. We had experts around the world giving them advice, but those experts need to be held accountable. It seems that we abandoned all the science we've generated over the past 100 years when we looked at this pandemic. So we can't say that there was a different view to it or a different approach to it. It was a completely unscientific approach that didn't gel with what we've learned over the past 100 years about vaccinology and virology. And so I think they need to be held to account, or at least explain why those poor decisions were made.
Okay. And so when we come to the book now, Gert, and we look at some of the big points in the book, one of the things that you did highlight was the fact that the immune response of someone who was infected versus vaccinated is so different. Can you give some clarity on that to the audience?
Yeah, well, again, to simplify things, I think it's important for people to realize that one element has been completely ignored in this approach, which is an element of our immune system that is nevertheless very well known, that you read in every textbook. It is often called the first line of immune defense, or the first line of immune defense, which relates to not only natural immunity, but especially also innate immunity. It's the first line that is ready to go immediately, that is not specific, but that can tackle a number of different enemies. And when I'm saying that people who were unvaccinated developed a completely different type of immune response, what I mean with that is that people who got exposed, being immunologically naive, because remember, that was the situation when the virus came in. The population was immunologically naive, and nevertheless, 90 or even more % of the population didn't really suffer from it. I'm not saying that people didn't become ill, were for a few days in bed, had some cough and respiratory illnesses, but certainly not severe disease, didn't need to be hospitalized, etc. So how can you explain that a new virus, comes to our countries, population is completely immunologically naive, the virus spreads pretty rapidly, and nevertheless, 90% of the population is protected? It can only be due to innate immunity, right? And then this innate immunity is so important. It's the infantry at the borders of a country that gets invaded by the enemy. The infantry are not specialized forces, but they can capture and catch a lot of the enemy, so that only few enemies can penetrate, and those will be attacked by the special forces, the B cells, and of course also the T cells. But what is important here is that the infantry, the first line of immune defense, takes out the bulk of the viral load, the bulk of the enemy. That is also the reason, Philip, why naturally induced antibodies are very often generating lower titers and are, declining pretty rapidly. Why? Because most of the viral load has already been taken out by the innate immune system, and therefore the antigenic stimulus of the adaptive immune response is relatively weak. So that is why the natural antibodies are, very often not very high, and they decline pretty rapidly. Now, what is the difference? So that is what's protecting an unvaccinated person. The combination, that is very important, the combination of the infantry with the special forces, the combination of the innate immunity, together with the special forces to be in the T cells. That is very different with vaccines, because the vaccines, of course, they stimulate interferons and cytokines, etc., but they do not stimulate the innate immunity, cell-mediated innate immunity. So they immediately stimulate antibodies. And of course, those stimulus is very strong. And then, of course, you see people comparing apples with pears, in the sense that they compare the antibody titers of the vaccinees with the antibody titers of people that have been exposed to natural infection. And they say, well, the vaccinal antibodies are much, much higher than the naturally induced antibodies. But that is just because the innate immunity works so well. And that innate immunity, we know this has been published already 20 years ago, can also acquire adaptive memory. So in other words, the innate immune system can get used and adapted and better prepared to a more infectious environment. This has to do with epigenetic changes of these cells, etc. I'm not going to go into that detail. But what is important is, whereas the vaccinal antibodies are specific are highly specific and of course have diminished neutralizing capacity when the virus is changing, becomes, for example, more infectious, this trained innate immunity will not care about these antigenic changes because it is pathogen non-specific. And therefore, it remains very, very strong, very functional, to an extent that I personally think that many unvaccinated right now who are healthy, they can just clear the virus based on this trained innate immunity, which of course is not the case with vaccines. They completely rely on the vaccine-induced antibodies. And if the virus has developed now resistance to these antibodies, that is a big, big problem, because there is nothing else that can compensate for it. In the unvaccinated, it's exactly the opposite. They have this robust innate immune response that they have very well developed. And therefore, I'm saying the situation, I've always said I'm the last one who would discriminate between vaccinees and unvaccinated, etc. But there is one thing that we cannot deny, which is that now, fundamentally, the immune status of a vaccinee is completely different from the immune status of an unvaccinated person. Over.
Yeah. So this is an important point, and I love having Shankara here because he can distill thoughts into very simple concepts. So based on what you did that very well, Geert, but I found that the repetition helps the audience to get that concept. So what did you get from that, Shankara?
I think, Philip, when you get I think to just put it into a broad nutshell, when you get a natural infection, you have your first line of defense, which is your mucous surfaces in your body, and they have the ability to take care of a virus. They stimulate your cell-based innate immune system. This doesn't need antibodies. It phagocytoses cells that are infected with the virus. So a majority of your virus in a natural infection gets taken care by your innate immunity. The little bit that gets through stimulates an adaptive response. Now, when you produce these neutralizing antibodies, they are generally short-lived so that they can deal with that particular variant of the virus, and then they disappear. So when you get another strain of the virus, your immunity is still able to adapt to that new strain, because the neutralizing antibodies that you made for the previous strain have waned. And so you have an open sheet to rewrite an antibody response to a new virus. Whereas with the vaccine, you are bypassing the innate immune system because it's an injectable vaccine. You're going directly to stimulating a humoral response, which directly takes you to an antibody response. Now, that antibody response is very specific for spike protein. It doesn't cover everything. And so when you have a change in that variant, straight away those antibodies don't address that variant. And as well, because those antibodies, being very specific, are long-lived, when you get another variant, you're not training your immune system. Your immune system is stuck on that previous antibody. And so you can't train it to adapt to a new variant. And that is where the problem starts to arise.
And so it really, thank you, Shankar, it really then comes down to, and this is what people have been saying in a very simple way, and I just wanted Geert to say this. Are we saying that the population in highly vaccinated countries now have a damaged immune response to variants of SARS-CoV-2, specifically Omicron? Is that a fair statement, or is that too simplistic?
Well, I would, you will never hear that I use the word damage, right? Because it seems like we are destroying things. What I'm always talking about is sidelining the innate immune system, for example, right? We know that, and these are things that have been published in peer-reviewed journals, that when the vaccine-induced antibodies, Shankara was saying, when they lose their neutralizing capacity, right? We know, and I explained this in my book, how the putative hypothesis, how these antibodies are generated. You generate non-neutralizing antibodies, and they can bind to the virus. They can bind to the virus, cannot neutralize it, of course. But they bind to the virus and they can enhance viral entry. So they can speed up the infectiousness of the virus to an extent that the innate immune system gets sidelined. So when it gets sidelined, it's no longer trained. It's not damaged. It's not, destroyed, but it's no longer in the play. So it doesn't get trained, and the vaccinees can no longer rely on it, which is, of course, very, very sad, because that becomes now the important line of immune defense when the virus evolves and the neutralizing antibodies do no longer function, do no longer neutralize that virus. So I would not talk about damaging, but rather about, sidelining, bypassing the immune system and abrogating its training, which is, of course, a critical problem when the virus is evolving.
So here's an interesting thought as you were talking. Was it that the scientific and political leadership so believed that the vaccine would bring herd immunity that we would never have to face this question in the future? Is that a reasonable thought, Shankara?
I think, Philip, the first thing that they needed to get right, if they were hoping to get herd immunity, was to develop a vaccine that creates neutralizing antibodies. I think within a month of the first vaccination in South Africa, I knew it doesn't stop infection and transmission, and herd immunity was out the window right at that point. So yeah, we might have developed a vaccine hoping to get to herd immunity, but we do understand the methodology in doing that. And as soon as we realize that the vaccine doesn't stop infection and transmission, it means doesn't have neutralizing antibody capacity, we should have abandoned that plan of trying to achieve herd immunity. And so we should have looked at the vaccine and rather used it to protect those at risk. But the attempt to get to herd immunity with a non-neutralizing antibody vaccine is nonsensical. Absolutely nonsensical, and it'll create more problems than it will solve.
And so it brings us to one of those big questions, Geert, about this IgG4. And for those who are not aware, it's just one of the 4 long-term antibodies that are more tolerant and tends to occur with patients who have been boosted with the vaccine. You don't call those tolerant antibodies, Geert. What do you describe them as in the book?
Yeah, well, this is indeed complex. I have been very much interested in studying antibodies that have low affinity. So, for example, I will give a very easy example. When the neutralizing capacity of the antibodies diminishes because, for example, we have another variant, for example, Omicron, right? Then you have, everybody understands, the vaccine breakthrough infections, right? These were the people who were vaccinated, who were exposed to Omicron, nevertheless started to develop symptoms, had the infection, etc. Vaccine breakthrough infection. What happens is that, in fact, the antibodies that were initiated, that were elicited by the vaccine, do not longer recognize the new variant Omicron with sufficient affinity. But they can still bind to the virus. They cannot no longer neutralize it, but they bind to the virus. These are antibodies that have low affinity. And I have been studying this because to me it seemed very, very important because these antibodies can still recognize the dominant epitopes on the spike protein, but not neutralize. They can mask those epitopes. And other epitopes that have not been exposed before, or that were exposed but that were outcompeted by the dominant epitopes, they can now induce antibodies. And these antibodies have low affinity. We call this phenomenon of hiding of the epitopes and exposing the subdominant epitopes. We call this immune refocusing. And now to your question, these antibodies have been shown to be of the IG4 subtype. And the IG4 subtype, of course, this is very well documented with regard to tolerance and a number of immune pathological diseases. But I found it very interesting that these antibodies, and maybe that is the reason why people are saying that they provoke tolerance, that they are hampering the uptake into antigen-presenting cells. And so remember, the low-affinity antibodies, they attach to the virus, cannot neutralize it, and then normally they should be taken up by antigen-presenting cells. Now, when this uptake is delayed or hampered because the antibodies that attach or IG4 type antibodies, then of course antigen presentation is weak. You have weak stimulus and it seems like the immune system is tolerant. But for me, the more important point was that when these antibodies attach and slow down uptake in the antigen presenting cell, that is where the subdominant epitopes have enough time to stimulate the immune system and where the immune focusing takes place. So I think it's not a contradiction. This is a kind of tolerance, I think, because of the uptake in antigen-presenting cells, which are key for immunogenicity, is hampered. But at the same time, it allows these new epitopes that have previously been outcompeted to indeed stimulate these low-affinity antibodies. So, I don't think there is contradiction, but I've just been studying those from the viewpoint of how does it change and help the immune system also to evolve in reaction to, for example, vaccine breakthrough infections, which were the consequence of Omicron, etc.
Yeah, and it brings me, I'm going to share some images that I'd mentioned before about my Substack. I'd be curious to hear Shankara's view from a clinical point of view. But essentially, what this shows is that you can see here that this is a normal immune response to natural infection. And the antibody level is at about 280 to 300, or between, say, about 42 to up to about 800. And so they use this as the marker for what they considered to be an adequate antibody response to the vaccine. But when you go lower down here, and this here now shows you the across different age groups, 16 to 24, 25 to 34, all the way up to over 80, what you see here is that an antibody response, 179 to 800, is this light blue one. So it's about here. But looking at the age groups as they get older, they are having antibody responses over 6,000. So wherever it's dark blue, look at the over 80s, it's over 6,000 nanograms per mil. So that could be up to 10,000, 15,000, and we're still boosting them. And my thought, Shankara, especially if we're seeing IgG4, any thoughts about how that will present in terms of, what will we see, do you think, clinically?
I think, Philip, we're going to see with IgG4, when it attaches to the virus itself, it suppresses the other immune cells from addressing the virus itself. That's how it builds some tolerance. So we're going to see prolonged infections where the immune system is not stimulated by the virus itself. And so you're going to see persistent viral infection with coronavirus, simply because you're not stimulating an immune response from it. From the slide that you showed, the antibody response is not necessarily a productive antibody response. So they haven't, in that slide, looked at whether we're dealing with neutralizing antibodies or non-neutralizing antibodies. You can see from the slide that as the age group goes up, there's more antibody production, and I think that's a lack of training of the innate immune system. And so I think in future, we're going to get a lot of more persistent coronavirus infections. Our body's not going to take care of it in the way it should.
And so, Geert, what does that mean at population level? And I think this is where it comes down to the crunch. People want to know, fine, we're talking about the science, but what really does that mean? Does it mean anything? Does it have any relevance to day-to-day life for people?
Well, again, as a vaccinologist and immunologist, what I would like to know about these antibodies is their functionality. What is their function? Because to your point, is this important? Is this important for people to know? Could this have an impact? I'm only saying that what I've been describing in my book is that it seems very likely that ultimately the vaccine breakthrough infections lead to more stimulation of non-neutralizing antibodies. And I don't know, I'm not aware of any publication where people have not only been describing, but really measuring and characterizing those antibodies. Because if this is the case, that people who have repeated vaccine breakthrough infection continue to stimulate and to boost their non-neutralizing antibodies, then of course, I mean, this is very, very problematic because, as I'm describing in my book, these are the antibodies, according to my humble opinion and analysis, that are right now, in the absence of neutralizing antibodies, still protecting people from severe disease, right? And these antibodies, these non-neutralizing antibodies, they are very weak. They are not supported by T help. So they are temporal, they can decline very rapidly, etc., unless they are continuously stimulated by reinfection, of course. And that is what is now, according to my analysis, at risk of putting immune pressure on the inhibition of severe disease, right? So in other words, when we talk about antibodies, what I like to see is always the dynamics, the evolution thereof, and the functionality. We are talking about antibodies, but as I said at the beginning, there is so many different types of antibodies with different affinities, etc., that are involved in this evolution. And we need to know. We need to know if we want to understand how the immune response is changing as a function of the virus that is evolving. We need to do characterization of these antibodies.
And Shankara, I mean, you don't want people to be frightened and worried. You know, if people are asking, because at the moment, the impression that is being given across the world is that the pandemic is over. The vaccines have solved the problem. We're not seeing severe disease, which is true. This is done. Why would you rock the boat?
Philip, I think if we left this to nature, we would have been at that point. The virus becoming endemic, and we would have had a good, robust immune response, population based. But what we have here is the vaccine has damaged the way we respond to the virus itself. Now, I think what Geert is alluding to, you develop non-neutralizing antibodies, polyreactive non-neutralizing antibodies that prevent you getting severe illness, right? But they're non-neutralizing. So what happens is when you got these non-neutralizing antibodies, at this point in the pandemic, we're seeing the decrease of severe illness in the vaccinated. And of course, with Omicron, we got a milder, more contagious strain. So that all ties in. We're seeing a far less pathogenic variant, but the people that are vaccinated are developing these polyreactive non-neutralizing antibodies. Now, what that does is it's putting pressure on the virus itself. Now, a virus can either become more infective and spread more rapidly, or it can become more virulent. Now, these non-neutralizing antibodies are not really putting any pressure on its ability to spread. So the contagiousness will reach its peak. But for the virus to continue spreading, because these non-neutralizing antibodies are preventing severe illness and death, the virus will mutate into a more virulent strain to overcome that. And so there's a risk that we're going to see a far more virulent virus variant in future, which means that it's going to cause far more severe illness. And we'll see far more virulent variants, which would have never happened if we had neutralizing antibodies from a natural immune response.
And so this is exactly what you've been saying, Geert, about societies being caught by surprise. Yeah. Is that about what you meant?
Yeah, and I think what Shankara was explaining is really completely up to the point. And you know, Philip, what is so amazing to me is that we have made this mistake already once with Omicron. Remember, Omicron was highly infectious, right? And it was spreading. And what were people saying? Well, this is just fantastic because this on top is going to boost the vaccine-induced immunity. And that is how we will automatically control the pandemic and where the virus will transition into endemicity. Right? I mean, we have a saying here in Flemish. I don't know how it translates in English, but it's something like a donkey does not stumble over the same stone twice, right? So what we are having right now is again variants, right? The XBB.1.5, etc. We had the BQ, etc. That again are not causing severe disease for the reasons that Shankara just explained that are extensively dealt with in my book, but they are still very infectious. So we have exactly the same situation. And guess what? Again, epidemiologists are saying, well, this virus is now spreading so fast, it's pushing out all the other variants, and, it will go into endemicity. And then I'm saying, where do we have in the whole history of infectious diseases and pandemics any example where you have a virus that becomes more infectious, that cannot be neutralized by neutralizing antibodies, and that for some reason spontaneously transitions into endemicity? I mean, there is this golden rule that if you cannot cut the transmission of the virus, you will not stop the pandemic. And that is again to Shankara's point. If you have this effective, neutralizing antibodies that can curtail the infection, you can reduce the transmission to a point such that even people who are not immunized will not catch the infection because the probability has become so low. That is the definition of herd immunity. Yeah, herd immunity is not saying, okay, guys, we vaccinated a lot of folks, and then others got natural immunity. We throw all this stuff together. We stick a name on this very sexy hybrid immunity, and that is what's going to drive the virus into endemicity. It has nothing to do with this, right? So we had this example with Omicron already once, right? And we thought it would end the pandemic. Now we have a similar example where, of course, the reason for preventing severe disease is the same, the non-neutralizing antibodies. And still, we think again naively that this is going to tame the pandemic. I mean, why gets the pandemic tamed? Because you develop sterilizing immunity. But we don't have this. So the pandemic is just continuing, but it's very, very, very tricky, of course, because the unvaccinated are better and better protected through their trained immunity, and the unvaccinated are still pretty well protected because they have this fragile protection for now against severe disease, right? So that is why I'm saying society will be caught by surprise in highly vaccinated countries, right? And it's just based on, I would say, what I call still science and scientific arguments and immunological analysis of how these things are evolving.
I, yeah, I'm going to make an important point here as I'm listening to this. As my research has always been about autoimmunity and the fact that severe disease is more of an autoimmune response to the viral spike protein. One of the interesting things we're seeing, and this is where I think the whole overlap of everything ties in, is that even though we're not seeing severe disease, across highly vaccinated countries, we are seeing rising excess mortality. So people are not dying of the severe COVID 19, but they're still dying of various other conditions. And this is where I'd pull in Shankara from his clinical observation. What do you think is causing that?
I think there's a twofold problem there, Philip. We've got the problems with immune issues, and that would cause an increase in COVID deaths. But we've seen an increase in excess deaths excluding COVID. And I think that relates more to the pathogenicity of spike protein rather than any immune or inappropriate immune response. So we know that spike protein does have some pathogenicity. We've discussed GP120 prions, its ability to influence P53 and the BRCA1 and 2 genes in the nucleus. So these are the effects of that we are seeing. Its effect on coagulation. We know that spike protein is expressed as a membrane protein. So just by its biodistribution and expression in cells around the body, we're going to see a wide diversity of autoimmune reactions because the immunity is going to want to go and address those foreign proteins now in the cell membrane of certain tissues in the body. And so we got this double-edged sword. We got one dealing with the vaccines and the immune problems that it causes and allowing for more severe infections. And we've got on the other end the pathogenicity of spike protein on its own. And by the vaccine making this toxic protein in the body, you're seeing the long-term biologic effects of spike protein. And we need to come to terms with those two differences there.
Mm. And so where do we go from here, Geert? So let's just say, imagine that, the powers that be said, listen, we've made a mistake. We have excluded Geert's opinion. We're going to bring him in now. And listen, Geert, we want you to direct us as to where do we go. What would you be saying to them?
Well, first of all, it becomes increasingly difficult to get out of this vicious circle. At some point, I was saying that Omicron is a point of no return because there's, the evolution of the pandemic is self-fueling because of the vaccine breakthrough infections. But so what I'm primarily concerned about, to answer your question is very easy, is the continuing evolution of the virus as a response to the increasing immune pressure that is suboptimal, that cannot prevent the infection, that cannot cut the transmission. That's what we are seeing. So if that is your concern, and that is my concern, at this stage where it becomes more and more tricky, because now we are talking about suppression of severe disease, that a blockade on severe disease that may be lifted, that might be lifted. So that is very serious stuff. So whereas in the past I was saying, okay, guys, let's see what's coming and let's do very early treatment. When patients start to develop symptoms, that is a special field of expertise of Shankara, etc., let's treat them. But when the virus is now highly infectious, resistant to neutralizing antibodies, and it breaks through this barrier of virulence, then all of a sudden there might be a risk that you have enhanced severe disease. So in that case, I would say antivirals no longer as part of early treatment, but even prophylactically in highly vaccinated populations. So instead of doing the mass vaccination now at this extreme point in the evolution, we have almost to correct the situation with mass prophylactic antivirals. Of course, nobody's going to do this. This is although I think it makes a lot of sense because that together with the sterilizing immunity that the unvaccinated are developing would bring down the transmission, if both complementary could still maybe cut the transmission to a level where we could control the virus. But this would now that in highly vaccinated countries, up to 60, 70, 80% of the population is vaccinated, it will require that you do prophylactic administration of antivirals to large parts of the population. I don't think this is going to happen. So it's a very difficult situation. But I'm also clearly saying in my book, this is very important, that there will be a certain percentage of the vaccinees that for me, for sure, will still be protected to the same extent as the unvaccinated. It all depends on the type of the vaccine that they have taken. mRNA vaccines are certainly not the best in that regard. It also depends on whether people were exposed already to the virus before they got vaccinated, the number of boosters that they gotten, etc. So it's not all like biology. It's not black and white. There is a gray zone in between. With regard to the unvaccinated, it's of course easy. I think the unvaccinated are pretty well protected, provided that they stay in good health. It doesn't help you to be well trained if your general health status is not good. So that is very, very clear. But to be open and honest, Philip, I don't have at this point 25 different recommendations on how we could still get out of this. Because as I was pointing out, I have been saying that for me, Omicron, it will be remembered in history as the point of no return, where we got these vaccine breakthrough infections that are self-fueling large-scale immune escape, right? So even if we had stopped the mass vaccination at that point, I don't think we would have been able to stop this evolution. Yes, we could have delayed it, but not stopped. And that is what I'm very concerned about. Over.
This is sounding like what we describe in physiology as irreversible shock. There is a point where no matter what you do, if someone has lost so much blood that you can't pull that person back. From a real perspective, it's very frustrating clinically, Shankara. What do you think this will present us? How will we see this?
I think, Philip, we're going to see a lot of morbidity and mortality that we can't explain with going forward. We've got, look, to get is right, to stop or negate the problem, we need to stop the offense, which is the vaccines, immediately. That is just compounding it every day. That's the first thing we need to do. I think the second thing we need to do is to be very vigilant about viral infections and use antivirals liberally, because that's the only thing in the vaccinated that's going to suppress viral transmission. And by doing that, you'll prevent the mutation in the virus or the mutations towards more virulent strains. So we need to start a campaign of looking at antivirals, even if they're simple antivirals like HCQ, but we give it liberally to every patient with the suspicion of a viral infection to limit the spread of that viral infection. The unvaccinated are pretty safe, but the threat posed to the unvaccinated comes from the vaccinated fostering a far more virulent variant that the unvaccinated don't have immunity to. But I'm sure we can train our immunity. So we've got to look at how to negate the virus. That's not even to taking into consideration the side effects of the vaccine that we see. So hopefully, if we stop what we're doing completely and address the problems in the virus, hopefully nature will allow our immunity to reset and regrow, and we put the past behind us. But hopefully we haven't done too much of damage to that.
Excellent. Now, listen, I'm going to ask you, gentlemen, to make a closing statement. I'm going to play the outro promoting Geert's book again, but I'm going to ask us to stay on live, and then we will probably try and address some of the questions that may be coming from the audience. And it will allow us to have a more, I would call it, a frank discussion, which will probably not be visible on YouTube or other platforms afterwards. So, and just to get a closing thought, first Shankara, and then Geert, and then we'll do some questions afterwards. So, what is your thought at the moment, Shankara?
I think, Philip, for everyone, no more vaccinations. We know the problems with that. We need to find a way to detox from the persistent spike protein production. We need to make sure our immunities are at their best. So the natural way is vitamin D, exercise, sunlight, to make sure that we're in peak health. I think that's about all we can do to try and negate what has already transpired. It's almost like having a war where the shots are fired, but we're waiting for the victims to fall. There's a delayed reaction here. And so all of us are trying to do our best to predict and plan for what's to come.
Excellent. And Geert, any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I would say very much that it is now, I think, primarily up to the clinicians, as Shankara was saying, to be very, very vigilant. Because, in fact, in a nutshell, what happened, I think we all agree, is that in highly vaccinated countries, because of the mass vaccination, we have been profoundly profoundly disturbing a natural balance between a pathogen and the host immune system. And of course, nature has a lot of buffer capacity, right? We can miss a little bit. There is buffer capacity. But once you have gone beyond that buffer capacity, it becomes very, very tricky. And that is my fear, that we are at that point right now, and that we need indeed be very, very vigilant to do the best we can when people indeed succumb, let's say, to more virulent variants, that we do whatever we can to save lives. I don't think it's a matter of, discriminating vaccinees or unvaccinated. All that is gone. It's now really being very vigilant and trying, with antivirals to save, when this virulence appears and emerges, to save as many lives as we can, to also avoid, remember, that our health system doesn't crash, because that would, of course, be, very, very sad.
Mm-hmm. So, yes, go ahead, Shankara.
Philip, I just wanted to add something to that. I think that the population of the world doesn't understand that when you're dealing with population dynamics, even the slightest adjustments have profound changes. It's like running a game reserve and having all these species in there and making sure you have the genetic diversity and making sure they all survive and thrive. And nature has a way of balancing that. Now, when you look at what we've done so far, we've increased the deaths, we've decreased fertility. And just those two, even a percentage on both ends, can lead to the extinction of humanity as we know it. That's how profound these influences impact on society. So what has transpired so far is vitally important for people to understand the impact of what it can have on us as humanity, and to take a step back and stop and look at it and trust nature in its ability to restore homeostasis and balance to this, and not keep interfering with it when we don't know what we're doing.
Absolutely. Geert, could you hold up your book for a second? I'm going to play that outro again for anyone who hasn't yet gotten. We can't see it yet, Geert. Where is it?
Oh, yeah. Well, that is.
Yes, the Inescapable Immune Escape Pandemic, as Geert has said. So I'm going to play this outro, and then we'll have a frank chat afterwards, not for too long, and take a few questions. So hang in there, gentlemen. Appreciate everyone who has been with us. As usual, Geert has given us tremendous insight. Thank you again, Shankara. And let's take it from here. Have a great evening, everybody.
We don't understand our weapon because we don't understand that prophylactic vaccines should not be used in the midst of an epidemic. And we don't understand exactly what the virus is doing. So we go to a war and we don't know our enemy, we don't understand the strategy of our enemy, and we don't know how our weapon works. I mean, how is that going to go? Then people say, well, politicians will probably say, we have been advised by the scientists, and scientists, will maybe point to somebody else. But this is now a situation. I'm asking every single scientist to scrutinize, to look what I'm writing, to do the science and to study exactly I call this the immune pathogenesis of the disease. And because, I mean, I like people to do their homework. And if the science is wrong, if I'm proven wrong, I will admit it. But I can tell you, I'm not putting my career, my reputation at stake. I would not do this when I would not be 200%, convinced. And it's not about me, not about me at all. It's about humanity. People don't understand what is currently going on, and we have an obligation to explain this. And I posted my paper on LinkedIn, and I invite all independent scientists, please, to look at it, because this can be easily understood by microbiologists, immunologists, geneticists,